Yesterday we talked about three attributes of God that we see in the first half of the Gospel according to Mark. Jesus shows us that God is a teacher, the source of wisdom for humanity. God is a protector, repelling the spiritual forces of darkness that would enslave humanity. And God is a healer, bringing to an end the afflictions that humanity faces. Today I want to tell you about a conflict that happens in the Gospel of Mark. There are some individuals introduced fairly early in the book, and this conflict starts as a slow boil, but by the 7th chapter, it reaches its peak. Jesus heals a man who is a paralytic, but only after forgiving his sins, which raises the hackles of a certain group that Mark calls some of the scribes. Then Jesus goes and eats with a known group of social deviants, tax collectors and sinners, as Mark calls them. This same group, now called the scribes of the Pharisees, sees what's going on and begins to question Jesus' methods and motives. They question Jesus about fasting in the next segment of Mark's gospel, which makes us think, hey, maybe they're embracing Jesus as a teacher. Then they ask Jesus why his disciples pick some heads of grain while they are on a Sabbath walk. Isn't that work? Okay, so maybe their intellectual curiosity about Jesus is in a bit of a disagreement about the Sabbath. Still, they seem like guys who might come around in the end. Now we're to chapter 3. Jesus finds a man with a withered hand. Continuing the conversation about the Sabbath, Jesus asks, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill? No one answers. And it grieves Jesus. That word grieves is the same word used to describe God's feelings about having created humanity at the time of the flood. Jesus heals the man, and this is what Mark records as the response. The Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians, that's rulers, against him, how to destroy him. Wow, that escalated quickly. It looks like chapter 4 is going to be full-on conflict between the Pharisees and Jesus, right? Well, actually, no. Jesus has one more small encounter with the Pharisees in verse 22 of chapter 3. The Pharisees accuse him of being demon-possessed, but he charges that they're wrong. Jesus tells them that he's come to overthrow the powers of darkness, and that clearly isn't the work of Satan. How dare they blaspheme the works of the Spirit of God? And then they stop bugging Jesus. I mean, maybe it's because Jesus gets out of town for a while and goes to do good works in an area on the very fringe of Israel, but up to this point, it's kind of seemed like the Pharisees are hot on his heels, looking for him to slip up. But for the next 3 chapters, there isn't really any more conflict between Jesus and the Pharisees. That ends in chapter 7. Hear these words. Now the Pharisees gathered to him with some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem. They saw that some of his disciples ate with hands that were defiled, that is, unwashed. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands properly, holding to the tradition of the elders. Okay, 1 second. Note that word, tradition. Lock it away in your mind for a moment. Now, back to Mark. And when they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash their hands. And there are many other traditions that they observe, such as the washing of cups and pots and copper vessels and dining couches. And the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands? Okay, they've asked Jesus questions like this before, and generally he's been cool about providing answers that don't escalate the conflict. Jesus doesn't play it cool here. His response? Well did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites, as it is written, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. You leave the commandment of God and hold to the tradition of men. And Jesus doesn't stop there. From here on out, Jesus publicly denounces the Pharisees, their teaching, and their oppression of people through the religion that the Pharisees have created. Jesus doesn't have time for people who uphold oppressive traditions and mask it as the truth of God. God is the God who builds a bridge to humanity, not barriers. And religion that aims to build barriers is not what God wants for his people. Jesus, as the image of God, shows what it means to oppose the traditions of men when they conflict with God's truth. And while he died for you and I, it was his regular and persistent insistence that the oppressive traditions of men were sinful that led him to the courtroom that would lead him to his crucifixion. I love you, and my prayer for you today is that you would be as passionate about the truth of God as Jesus was.